Sample of Form F, the old format which we are not using anymore. We are registering all the deals on Dubai Rest app so that all the deals will be registered in RERA. But the old school, the old contract, this is the a sample of it which says the details of the seller, details of the buyer, details of the property, original price, paid amount, selling price, listed price, seller's agent, buyer's agent's commission, seller's agent's commission, mortgage, rent, seller's name, buyer's name, date of signing the contract, transfer, the deadline for the transfer, deposit or down payment, final payment to the seller, who pays the land transfer fees, who pays the seller's agent commission, who pays the buyer's agent commission, and the additional conditions. Since the terms and conditions mentioned in the contracts, in the original contracts provided by RERA are very general and very basic, we always add additional terms and conditions, either in the last page of the contract as additional conditions or as an addendum. The additional conditions, I'll give you some samples. These are just some samples. Each and every case has a different story. Each and every deal has different terms and conditions. These are just some samples. Well, sample of the contract. Number one, upon signing this contract, the buyer shall submit a security deposit check, which is usually 10% of the selling price. It will be kept with the seller's agent, usually. It's not a must. But usually, RERA suggests that the buyer's deposit check is kept with the seller's agent. And sometimes, not always, not necessarily, when there is a security deposit check from the seller, which is like less than 10% of the cases, because usually as per the practice of the market, sellers are like, my property is involved, you can go ahead and block my property, you can go ahead and file a case against me and block my property, so that's why I don't want to put a security deposit check. So usually the security deposit check is provided by the buyer only. It can be kept with the buyer's agent or with the seller's agent. RERA suggests that the buyer's security deposit check is kept with the seller's agent and the seller's deposit check with the buyer's agent. However, even if there is a default or back out from any of the parties, if any of the parties back out and do not continue, do not proceed with execution of the transfer, you may not, even if there are 1 million witnesses, you may not go ahead and cash the check or hand over the check to the other party without the consent or without the order of Dubai courts. Back in the days, in case of any default, cases go to Dubai Land Department, and Dubai Land Department or RERA, they will support you to resolve the case, and then from there you will go to the court, but now not anymore. There is any dispute in terms of back out or default in the deal, go directly to the court. So, that is force majeure, that you have to prove it to the court that it was force majeure, it was out of my control, blah, blah, blah. So, first clause, I personally usually always put the security deposit. Second, when the deal is subject to a mortgage, sometimes, again, I'm telling you, I'm repeating myself, these terms and conditions are not a standard, are not a must. These are just samples. When the deal is subject to a mortgage, sometimes the buyer wants to say that, okay, I'm ready to give you a deposit check, I'm ready to sign this contract, I want to go ahead and buy this property, condition that I can get an approval of 2 million dirham on the valuation. Because if the valuation I get from the bank will be less than 1.9 or 1.8 million, then I cannot afford to pay the balance amount. I can pay 20% of this price and I can stretch myself to 25%. So this, we can mention it in the contract, that if the valuation comes below a certain amount, the buyer has the right to exit without any penalty. Clear, Khalil? Clear? You can mention in the contract that if the valuation or the approval comes below a certain amount, the buyer will have the right to exit will have the right to cancel and terminate the agreement without any penalty. It's mutually agreed and understood that the buyer has applied for a mortgage. Validity of this deal will be subject to final approval of the mortgage and evaluation of minimum X dirham as evaluated price. In the event that the mortgage is not approved before so and so date, or the evaluated price is less than X amount, then the buyer will have the right to cancel this deal and this contract will be null and void. Null and void means as if it didn't exist, without any compensation penalty. In this case, buyer will pay the brokerage fees. This is also negotiable. Who wants to pay the brokerage? In this case, the buyer will say that no, I don't want to pay brokerage. For the rented properties, if the property is rented until this amount for this much price, the seller undertakes and confirms that any deposits, advance, rentals, any payment, any contract, anything related to the rent must be handed over by the seller to the buyer at the time of transfer. Okay? So, the rental income until the date of the transfer will be on the account of the seller, and after the date of transfer, it will be on the account of the buyer. Okay, so on the date of transfer, like we explained yesterday, on the date of transfer, you will calculate the rental income and the service charges on pro rata basis. For the service charges, you will calculate on pro rata basis from the date of transfer until whatever date it has been paid. You will calculate the service charges and the buyer pays them back to the seller. Service charge. For rental income, if it has been agreed, like we discussed yesterday, for the rental income, if the rent is refundable for the balance period of time, again, we'll calculate it on pro rata basis. From the date of transfer until the date that it has been paid, it will be calculated on pro rata basis and paid by the seller to the buyer. Because from the date of transfer, the property belongs to the buyer and its rental income was agreed to belong to the buyer. Also, if there are any other checks, they have to be given by the seller to the buyer on the date of transfer. Also, the rental deposit, which is received by the landlord, must be paid by the seller to the buyer. Also, the tenancy contract, the checks, keys, access card, anything related. So make sure you have a checklist when you go for the transfer to make sure that everything is done. So here also, for more safety, I've mentioned it in this sample contract that the seller undertakes and confirms that any deposit, advance, rental payments received by the seller for the period after the transfer of the title and any security deposits under the rental shall be paid in full by the seller to the buyer on the date of transfer. Okay. Or it can be deducted from the purchase price. We can do that as well. It can be deducted from the purchase price as mutually agreed between the seller and buyer. This or means you put either this clause, this part, or this part. This is a sample. This is a draft. The seller shall deliver these documents within 2 days, within 3 days, or on the date of transfer. Title, deed copy, ijari copy, blah, blah, blah. If the property is vacant, I don't need this clause. I will mention that the property is vacant and all the property documents, settled bills of service charges, security cards, access cards, keys, everything will be handed over by the seller to the buyer on the date of transfer. Maintenance and service charge until the date of transfer is on the account of the seller. After that, it will be on the account of the buyer. So it has to be calculated on pro rata basis and paid by the buyer to the seller or added to the price. Both parties undertake to provide the required documents. If there is any rejections or any delays from Dubai Land Department, from the developer, anything that is out of the control of the buyer or the seller, if any incident happens, which is not a default, which is not a personal thing, which is not a back out, anything, any rejection, any delay out of the control of the buyer or the seller shall not be considered as any party's default. And in this case, the contract example, it's not a standard, it's not the law. Here in this contract, I had agreed between the buyer and the seller that in such cases, this contract will be automatically extended for another 30 days. If the problem remains, if the problem is still there after 30 days, in that case, extension, in this example, extending after 30 days will be subject to mutual agreement between the buyer and the seller. Again, I'm repeating myself. It's case by case, depends on what will be the deal. But all these terms, why I'm showing it to you, you have to know what are the points that you need to make sure to discuss them between the buyer and the seller and reach to an agreement. You need to explain to them if there is any rejection, any delay from the bank, from developer, from Dubai Land Department, from the trustees, contract will be automatically extended. For how many days? Or yes or no? Or with penalty or without penalty? In that case, who will pay the brokerage fees? So everything you have to make it clear and put it in writing. In the event of seller's default, the buyer's security deposit check, because in this example, in this sample, buyer is only providing a security deposit check and seller is not giving a deposit check. In this example, you can get from both. If the seller backs out, buyer's okay, here I always make it specific with the order of Dubai courts / Dubai Land Department.
Is there such an order?
I always do that, yes. Yeah. You can go to the court. With the order of Dubai court or Dubai Land Department. If the seller backs out, buyer security deposit check will be returned to the buyer and the seller will have to pay this much penalty. Or if the buyer backs out with the order of Dubai courts, with the order of Dubai Land Department, otherwise you are not allowed to give the buyer's manager check, buyer's deposit check to the seller or the opposite. You can't do that without the order of Dubai courts or Dubai Land Department. And then who will pay the brokerage fees and how much?